Good afternoon, colleagues. Chers collègues, bienvenue et merci pour votre intérêt. And welcome to our very special guest today. Bienvenue à notre invité d'aujourd'hui, Mark Carney. This is our 7th Senators for Climate Solutions event. It's an absolute pleasure to have our members come together to hear from Mr. Carney and have an opportunity to ask him our questions. I would like to welcome a new member to Senators for Climate Solutions, the Honorable Clément Gignac, who is joining us today. Welcome, Senator. We're delighted to have you. Bienvenue, Senator Gignac.
Merci.
Well, we love having you with us. Almost 1 year old, our Senators for Climate Solutions group has 44 members, senators from all Senate groups and regions of our country. I'm speaking to you today from Ottawa, the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. We have a few housekeeping announcements before we begin. We have prepared a list of questions that senators from our group submitted in advance. Senator Kutcher and I will take turns asking Mr. Carney these questions, and I apologize in advance as we may not get to all of the questions submitted. There were many submitted. There's a lot of interest in this event. This session will be recorded and distributed to our members who are not able to be with us here today. Please note that simultaneous interpretation is provided for this meeting. At the bottom of your Zoom window, you can find the icon that indicates interpretation. Please click on that and choose your preferred language. Special thank you to Senators Saint-Germain and Senator Dean for their financial contributions to the interpretation, along with Senator Kutcher's office and my own. We feel that interpretation is an essential service, and we will do our best to always ensure we have interpretation. It is now my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Mr. Mark Carney, who is the United Nations Special Envoy for Climate Action and Finance. He's an economist and a banker who served as the governor of the Bank of England from 2013 to 2020. And prior to that, as everybody I'm sure here knows, as governor of the Bank of Canada from 2008 until 2013. Previously, he worked at Goldman Sachs as well as the Canadian Department of Finance. He is currently vice chair of Brookfield Asset Management and their head of transition investing. He is a longtime and well-known advocate for sustainability, specifically with regards to the management and reduction of climate risks. Last year, Mr. Carney published his influential national bestseller entitled Values, Building a Better World for All. It is a weighty tome, I know. I have it and I'm in it, but it's very well worth reading. Welcome, Mr. Carney. We are thrilled to have you join our climate senators today. Now on to our fireside chat. I'll ask the first couple of questions if I could, Mr. Carney. Mr. Carney, our group, Senators for Climate Solutions, has come together to promote climate action. Your book, Values, Building a Better World for All, is about achievable solutions to rebalance our world. Coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic and in the context of other major global challenges we are experiencing, could you touch on the reason you wrote this book, your major observations from the book, and what solutions you are proposing? Mr. Carney?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I'd like to thank all the senators for your attendance today and for what you're doing as was just outlined, coming together to find solutions to this issue that support all Canadians. I wrote the book, my experience, and I'll try and be brief on this, but my experience as a central bank governor in Canada and the UK was one of crisis. It was one of a series of crises. I started with the financial crisis. There was the Euro crisis, the Brexit crisis, the climate crisis building throughout, and then actually my last weeks were the start of the health crisis that we've all been living through, the COVID crisis. And part of the question that I was trying to ask myself was there some common element to these? And then building out from that in terms of solutions. You're right. I probably could have edited it more judiciously, so I apologize for that. But to get to the essence of what's most relevant, I think, for our discussion today, is that I was trying to draw out the relationship between value in the market, and values in society. And that is a two-way relationship. We need certain values for markets to function well. Many of Senator Gignac, I'm sure, knows this well from his time in the financial markets. We need regulation, of course, but we also need certain principles that underpin this. And this was part of the other part of Adam Smith's genius was the importance of those values, not just the power of the market. But, and to get to the topic today, if Canada is clear about what it values, sustainability, solidarity, fairness in our society, then we can help put the market in service of those values. And that's where this starts to come together in terms of policy prescriptions. For a long time, Canadians have supported sustainability, environmental causes, but that has not necessarily translated into clear objectives. That began to change over the course of the last few years, not just in Canada, but globally. And Canada helped lead many of these changes. So the objectives became crystallized around pathways of emission reductions, and more specifically to the objective of achieving net zero. Now, I should acknowledge, as the senators know, that getting to net zero doesn't solve all environmental issues, far from it. Issues of biodiversity, for example, and nature will still be with us. And it doesn't solve certainly societal issues, fairness, solidarity in that transition and in the end position. But it is absolutely necessary to arrest climate change. We can't stabilize temperatures at 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, even, unless we get to net zero. And so having that objective, that value of society, sustainability, and mapping it into net zero as an objective, then creates some of the conditions for the market to work in service of that objective. And so what the book, and I think we'll get into this more specifically, the work that I've been doing with others over the last few years has been how to organize the financial system, the financial markets, with that objective, to ensure that the decisions that are taken in the financial system take this objective of Canadians, sustainability, and more specifically getting to net zero, that those markets take that into account in their lending decisions, in their investment decisions, in their risk management decisions. And it's through that process, when brought together with the objectives of Canadians, the preferences of Canadians, what kind of goods we buy or services we use, and very importantly, the policies of government today and in the future, crucially in the future, the credibility of those policies in the future, as that comes together, then we get the investment today to solve the problems tomorrow. And that's the virtuous cycle that we can start, that we can set up. And we're starting to do that. The reason for your inquiry and your interest is we're not all the way there. And there's a lot more to be done. But so the objective of the book started in, and I'll finish here, in history, from my own experience, but then trying to broaden it out to the history of economic thought and philosophy, and then make it practical around specific issues of how do we apply this relationship between value, the market, and the values, what Canadians want.
Wonderful. Thank you. And as you said, we will be drilling down into a number of the areas that you dealt with in the book. We also have a group that has worked significantly on the issue of prosperity for our country. So this next question is one that I think will resonate with that group. Mr. Carney, you've said that the goal of net zero is the greatest commercial opportunity of our time. Could you tell us why you believe this to be the case? And could you expand on what you believe the implications are for Canada of this greatest commercial opportunity of our time, particularly if you could also relate that to the federal commitments outlined in the recently released 2030 emissions reduction plan? I mean, don't limit yourself to that, but if you could speak about this.
Yeah, very good. I think the first thing to say is that on a high level, conceptual level, is we're facing this virtually existential risk. Obviously, in the extreme, it is an existential risk, but this fundamental risk of mounting physical climate impacts that will affect the lives and livelihoods of all Canadians. I can say this being from the north, and will affect us disproportionately in the north of Canada and then down through Canada. So we have this fundamental problem, increasingly understood, and the impacts just beginning to be felt, and all of the. And I'll say, but just by way of background, one of the things that responsibilities I had in the past was to oversee the insurance industry and the reinsurance industry, particularly Lloyd's of London. And so if you have that responsibility, you become very familiar with climate modeling and what's happening. And the impact of extreme weather has been on the upside of the modeling. So it has been as severe or more severe than expected. So there's more in the pipeline. Anyway, so we have this big risk. The extent to which you can solve a problem that society has decided to address, you are creating value. Now, the question is, how do we put numbers around that value that's created? And let me give a couple of lenses on that. The first is in terms of the global investment need to address climate change. The incremental amount of investment is something on the order, and there's various ranges of investments. I'll take the lower end of that, but is about $2 trillion of additional investment a year in the energy sector alone. So it's not just the investment that today is put into oil and gas and transferring that to renewable or cleaner energy over time, but it's an additional $2 trillion for reasons that'll become apparent, I think, in our discussion. I'm sure you're familiar with, but we'll raise in our discussion. And that is an enormous, it sounds like a big number. It is an enormous number. It's about 2 percentage points of GDP year in, year out for 30 years. Within Canada, it's a similar order of magnitude over the course of the next 25, 30 years of what we need to do. We need to do about an additional $60 billion of investment in energy systems, about 4 times the run rate at present of clean energy, that various estimates, but let's say 3 to 4 times that run rate. So huge investments that will be required. Now, that is solving a problem, and it is creating value and jobs and GDP in the context of that. The second element, and I'll finish my answer with this, just in terms of, so the first is just the scale of the investment opportunity. The second element, though, of value creation or commercial opportunity is that increasingly companies, regardless of sectors they're in, will be judged in part about whether they are becoming part of the solution to climate change or they remain part of the problem. So in other words, do they have plans to reduce their emissions consistent with the transition that Canada is undertaking and as laid out in the emission reduction plan? And I'll come back to that in a second. Or are their pathways inconsistent or diverging from the pathways that are required in the building sector, in the heavy industry sector, in oil and gas, et cetera? And what is going to happen, and it's already happening, is that will be one of the determinants of the value, the equity value of a company. And we see this in jurisdictions that have been a bit ahead of Canada in terms of information about the emissions positions of companies, and have arguably been a bit ahead in terms of the predictability of climate policy. So just to put a number around that, in Europe, European equities, if you look at the valuation premiums of companies within a sector that are low emission versus higher emissions, that premium has more than tripled over the course of the last decade as more information has come. So it's increasingly a driver of value, and it's, again, for those who follow statistics, it's a very high correlation, about 0.7 correlation with the climate performance, just around net zero, the net zero element, not a broader ESG metric or anything like that. So we'll see that. I'm pretty confident we'll see that increasingly in Canada. Therefore, value creation opportunity, and this is what we want, and this is where I get to the ERP, because this will flow money, not just to green projects, I mean, but yes, we want wind and solar and batteries and hydrogen and all those aspects. But very importantly, to those projects in industries that are heavy emitters, in the oil and gas sector, in the building sector, transportation sector, and others, where companies have plans and investments to get those emissions down. And what the part of what the ERP does, and I'm not the appreciate I wasn't involved in the development, so I'm not as totally familiar. But what I see in the ERP and other climate policies in Canada, and what I see elsewhere in the world that works, are the types of policies that have very clear objectives, regulations, and or prices towards the end of this decade, and are credible in terms of how those are built. And I'll come to specific examples. The reason I say that, though, to get to the punchline, is that things like a $170 price per ton for carbon in 2030 that's legislated, and as you know, backed up now, or intended to be backed up with a carbon contract for difference, something that was in the ERP, very important initiative. Well, that's what's decisive for investment today, for companies that they know the carbon price is $50 today, but what's relevant is when the plant comes on, is that will be the price at that point. And if they're saving carbon, that's the calculation they use. Objectives that are reinforced in the ERP, although not formally or as formally developed, if I can say it that way, such as the clean grid for 2035, or the moratorium on new internal combustion engine vehicles 2035. Again, those have a similar impact. And I'll stop with this, which is that in the UK, where I have some familiarity, and in Europe, those types of, if I can call them, deep decarbonization policies that have certainty in the future, clarity, relative simplicity and clarity, but give industry, businesses, people time to adjust, in the financial sector, a direction of where the money should go. Those are the types of policies that will deliver the highest impact and value creation in terms of growth, jobs, but also candidly creating value for companies that then can be reinvested in the economy.
Thank you. They're very, very helpful. Over to you, Stan.
Yeah, thanks, Mary. Thanks, Mr. Carney. Just going to drill down a little bit on picking off from what you said. Last year, our biggest banks, known as the Big Five, signed on to the United Nations Net Zero Banking Alliance. We also know that the Big Five are amongst the world's top lenders to the fossil fuel industry. Given the significant emissions associated with both fossil fuel production and downstream combustion, many people have argued that the banks need to quickly reduce these oil and gas sector investments, while others are arguing that these investments are actually necessary to moving these companies to net zero. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on this particular issue.
Yeah, well, thank you, Senator. It's an important question. And of course, in the Canadian system, the banks are at the heart of so much. So it's critical what they do and the pathways they follow. And I should start by commending them for joining the Net Zero Banking Alliance. What they've signed up for is not just Net Zero 2050. And to be clear, and I know you know this, but just to read it into the record, what's important is the financed emissions, so the emissions of their clients, the people they lend to or invest in. And what's important as well is the scope 3 emissions of those clients as well, because in the most difficult areas, oil and gas, scope 3 is everything, if you will, or almost everything. So they've signed up for that. They've also signed up for their fair share by 2030 and for annual reporting with decarbonization plans, which are due in about 18 months' time. So there's a lot of work they need to do, from commitment to plan to action. That's the first thing. The second is what's hugely important here is the pathway, and particularly for the oil and gas sector. Now we have some very high level, the collective we have very high level pathways for oil and gas from the International Energy Agency, which says the world should finance about $400 to $600 billion a year for existing infrastructure in the transition on the oil and gas side, and more than quadruple that for the clean energy side. So it's relevant what our banks are doing on one versus the other and what the pathway is. But then secondly, to go back to the previous question, what's relevant is the pathway for our energy sector that is developed, and the emissions pathway for our energy sector that comes out of not just the ERP, so-called ERP, but our broader policy, federal and provincial policy for that. And are the banks, is their financing consistent with plans that are getting those emissions down? And we may have a chance to talk to it. I'll hand back to you, so I'm using the time effectively. I'll make 2 points. One is that we will want disclosure from the banks in Canada and globally that is much clearer about what type of projects they're financing in the energy sector. What is for new development, what is for carbon reduction, what is a transfer of existing assets, those elements, and how is that consistent with the pathways? And I'll make 2 final points. One of the things globally where we have a hole, quite frankly, is I mentioned the IEA, but that's very high level. There is not a quote science-based pathway for the oil and gas sector. There is for many other sectors. There isn't for oil and gas. So therefore, we need something from the Canadian side. And GFANS, the group that I help chair, we're actually going to help develop one globally as well, because otherwise people are comparing to, they don't have a comparison of what good looks like. And then the last point I want to make, and I'll defer to you in terms of how much we want to speak about it. But there are some quite substantial investments in the oil and gas sector that are possible in order to get emissions down quite substantially from scope 1, scope 2 development. And of course, we will likely need our banks and our pension funds to help finance those investments if they come to pass.
Well, thank you for that. In terms of helping us understand how the banking sector in Canada might fit into the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero that you actually helped catalyze or birthed, how does that fit? Help us understand more about that initiative, and how do we fit into that, and what's happening on that road, particularly as we're approaching COP27?
Yeah, so what we look to do with the Glasgow Financial Alliance is there were a series of initiatives, although there was not one for banking. There were a series of initiatives in asset management for pension funds, effectively so-called asset owners, the insurance industry, and now banking, that were making commitments to net zero. We're looking to level those up and raise those up to a common standard, net zero 2050, fair share 2030, the same accounting for the emissions of their portfolios, decarbonization plans, annual reporting, et cetera. So all of that's coming together. And then to get the various components to work together to make that happen. So the banks are part of that and are going to be held to that standard. Now, what we're doing right now is, as this alliance, is we're converting, well, we're not converting, the individual banks and others will convert their commitments into action plans. But we are literally in 2 weeks' time, on the 15th, a little more than 2 weeks, 15th of June, we're setting out a series of frameworks for what is best practice on a financial institution net zero plan. What are these sectoral pathways that we refer these plans to? How do you wind down the so-called stranded asset? It could be in the coal industry, could be in other industries, because we don't want to push all those stranded assets into the darkness and have them run for longer than is appropriate. So how do you wind down that responsibly? So we're going out for public consultation with the intention of completing this by Sharm el-Sheikh, the COP27 in November, that this is the approach. If you are a responsible financial institution, you're committed to helping your clients get on the path to net zero, this is what you want from your clients. This is the information you want. This is how your homework should be marked. And this is how you're going to report what you do. So it's very much a necessary condition for the system to work. So our banks fit into it, from that perspective. And we've already seen the first early cuts of some of these plans. They will become more ambitious and more, I'll use this word, granular, more detailed, and over the course of the next year. And I should say one other thing, and I'll hand back, which is that one thing we're doing, the system's being built very rapidly, and one thing that all stakeholders deserve, employees, shareholders, communities, Canadians, all Canadians deserve, people around the world deserve, is a way to go, is an open source database to go and compare these things on an apples to apples basis, so we can judge who's ambitious, who's doing well, who isn't, and have it properly interrogated. So we're going to help build that up as part of GFANS.
Okay, I find that very helpful. Thank you very much for explaining in a way that I can understand. It's sort of a little bit of comment on this before I hand it over to Mary. It's a bit like building the engine while you're flying the plane, which is amazing.
Well, we are definitely, if I may just respond to that, that is the right analogy. The collective we have left this late. 3 or 4 years ago, for most financial institutions, climate was a corporate social responsibility issue. It wasn't a core strategic issue. They were not committed to net zero. In fact, to put a number on it, 2 years ago, a little more than 2 years ago, only $5 trillion in the global financial industry was committed to net zero. Now it's $130+ trillion. So there's a huge shift. But what is good in that commitment? How exactly do you build these plans? How can the world compare what's good, what's not on those plans? And all of that is being built to add to the flying, building while we're flying the plane. The navigation system for this, if I can try and extend the analogy, which is the accounting system, the disclosure system for finance and climate, which you may, I'm sure, familiar with the TCFD, which was a private sector initiative. Now that's becoming a public sector initiative through the International Sustainability Standards Board, co-located in Montreal, a Canadian success. But that navigation system, that disclosure system, is also being built at the same time we're building the plane while it's flying. And there's and finish with the analogy, and there's a big climate storm coming at us. So we need to get all of this completed with haste.
Thank you.
Well,
Thank you.
And while we've got that climate storm coming, we've got this inflation storm that's upon us right now, not just here in Canada, but around the world. So if you could take a minute just to help us understand what the possible impacts of climate change might be on inflation itself, okay? And then, do you have any ideas about how, for instance, the Bank of Canada could manage inflation in such a way that mitigates the damaging impacts of climate change now and into the future? So we know there's a lot of factors affecting the current wave of inflation that we're experiencing right now, but let's bring it back to climate change, if we could.
Yeah, the short-term impacts of climate change on inflation principally relate to the physical impacts of climate change and the disruptions, or their contribution to supply chain disruptions, and unfortunately also in some case, and I hesitate to say this, but well, this is the way things are trending at the moment. As senators will be aware, Canadians will be aware, we have a looming food crisis driven first and foremost by the war, Russia's unjust war in Ukraine, and the calamity that's coming from that, not just in in grain, but also in fertilizers and the knock-on effects. But on top of that, we have extreme weather, a series of extreme weather events, extreme heat in India, which is affecting the crops there. Farmers in Western Canada will know that it's been much wetter than usual. And so the planting has been delayed. We have problems in Brazil that are also climate related or weather related. So, we have elements of this which affect supply chains with some disruptions. Also, unfortunately, it appears coming together at a time where we have man-made or human-made problems because of Russia's aggression. So there's that aspect that flows through to inflation without question. I think what I would underscore is that with respect to the medium term, over the course of this decade, and I've done some analysis on this and spoken to this a bit, is that one would expect that there is some inflationary impact over the medium term from climate change because of the scale of the restructuring that's required in various industries. So anytime you have a big shift in industry because of a new trade deal or because of, in this case, moving towards a lower carbon future, people are changing jobs. Some new investments are being put in place. There are some frictions that always come in the economy. Now, Canada is a very flexible economy, very flexible labor market, so we will have fewer of those than others. But we have some of our own challenges. So that process does bring some inflationary pressures in the medium term. It's readily addressable by the central bank, particularly when you have a persistent shock and a relatively predictable shock, as opposed to a one-off, warlike or weather-related shock. I think what's important to recognize is that what we're doing is moving to actually a lower cost energy system. So when we have this period, and then the payback, the positive payback, is that the marginal costs of energy and electricity will be an increasing component of that, will be much lower and less volatile. So, if we just take a step back and look at the current situation from a global energy perspective, which affects Canada, I mean, we do have a system which is unreliable. We've seen it with Russia's aggression, but there are other factors that can knock out supply and lead to very extreme price volatilities. It's unaffordable in many respects. We've got billions of people who don't have access to the energy, so it's inaccessible. And of course, it's unsustainable as well because it's building the climate crisis. So we have a current system that, as the Brits would say, is not fit for purpose. And we need to move to this system. There is some friction that comes with that, and some element inflation. Now, what the Bank of Canada can do, and obviously I don't want to be in a, and you're not asking me to be in a position to suggest to my successor what they should do. Over the medium term, though, so I'm not doing that, but what the bank does is twofold, and they're already doing this. One is understanding the exposures and how the financial system and the Canadian economy is going to adjust to this. So they've done a tremendous amount of work on this through climate stress testing with OSFI, through scenario analysis, through understanding the risks, and helping the system as a whole. They've contributed to the system as a whole, including personally the governor and his co-leadership of an expert panel a few years ago, to ensuring that the market has the information it needs to make this shift. All of that it does two things. It reduces any inflationary pressures and actually pays bigger dividends and growth in jobs sooner for Canadians. And then the other thing they can do and will do is, in terms of conventional monetary policy, they take this into account with other factors so that they set a monetary policy appropriate to the 2% target.
Thank you. And of course, we wouldn't want to put you in a position to be recommending things to your successor. Switching gears a little bit here now. in budget 2022, Canada's budget 22, there were tax credits for carbon capture, utilization, and storage projects. You're probably very aware there's a controversy around this, not going far enough, coming from certain elements in the oil and gas sector, going too far. You're sustaining, a sector that, yes, maybe you're going to be dealing with, capturing at source, reducing carbon emissions in the production side of things, but still going to be combusted, and the whole argument around that. One of our senators has asked whether you believe this investment in carbon capture, utilization, and storage is an effective means to get to net zero, in terms of the investment in the oil and gas sector, or any other sectors that you'd like to speak of in this issue of CCUS.
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing to say is that there is a transition in oil and gas, as we all know, and Canada has an opportunity to play a role in that transition, and certainly from a North American energy system. It has to be in a position, and I think the industry recognizes this, where our oil and gas is low carbon, ultimately no carbon, is low cost, and is reliable. I mean, the reliability is there, but the other metrics of energy security and sustainability are low cost and low carbon. And so many efforts are there to get the marginal cost down. So the additional barrel cost, and the industry has been very good at that and there has been some progress on emissions, but not the orders of magnitude that are required. And the industry has banded together to make major investments, or potentially major investments, in carbon capture and storage, in order to effectively eliminate scope 1, scope 2 emissions from a barrel of oil sands oil, which, if that's successful, during the transition, will preserve a role for that oil in continental energy security, which is a good thing for the main customers, which are American, actually. Good thing for Canada, good thing on the margin for the planet, because it's lower carbon. We want lower carbon barrels delivered, and the only way to get that, or the main way to get there, is through successful carbon capture and storage. Now, there are different views on whether or not this technology will be truly successful at scale. I would say that we are seeing some examples of it being successful. There's a company called Entropy, where I should disclose that my other role at Brookfield, we have an investment in a company called Entropy, Western Canadian carbon capture company that is a commercial investment. The question is, can the world, or can Alberta rather, or Canada, do this at a scale for the oil sands as a whole? I think that the investment tax credit that was provided in the budget is the right approach to help that process along. That there will need to be very substantial private capital that goes in to develop this. And it's not for me to say, but my view is that the industry will come in behind that, as will the provincial government, because this is necessary. It's necessary for competitiveness, and it's necessary for sustainability. I would further make the point that some others do, which is that from a Canadian perspective, from a national competitiveness perspective, jobs diversification perspective, developing successful carbon capture and storage expertise, technologies, and actual success with that is a necessary condition for us to develop a blue hydrogen industry, and to realize the potential of much of our natural gas resources as well. And so all of that is about investment, jobs, growth, and greater sustainability in Canada. then there's a question of whether we would export the technology and the expertise to others who might need it. But just in and of itself, the advantages in Canada, but are there. To be clear, though, and I, those who are more expert than I would, I think, say this, because I've heard them say it. The industry is coming together because they're looking to pool expertise, because the need for this is in relatively short period of time. And so, and they know it can work at certain scales, and they want it to work at industry-wide scale. And so there are execution issues around it. It is not as simple as, and I'll finish with this, it's pretty straightforward now to build a wind farm, to build a solar array. These technologies are proven. You can do it at scale. You have to get, obviously, planning permission, and you have to have some operational expertise, but you don't need the support for it. That was not the case 10, 15 years ago. That changed in part because of similar types of support in Europe and in the UK specifically, which took those technologies, which were uneconomic, and dragged them into becoming wildly economic, and the world is benefiting from that. We're in that position. Canada, are in that position with carbon capture and storage, which we need for our oil sands industry, and we need for our potential blue hydrogen industry. Doesn't mean we're going to get what we need. You don't always get what you need, but we can make those investments, and that's what the government and the industry intends to do. It is also true, just on the cusp, this for green hydrogen, which is getting closer and closer to becoming economic, but is not quite there. And so there's logic to providing support to accelerate the development and application of those technologies. And look, if we were addressing climate change over the course of the next 50 or 75 years, and we had a carbon budget that was consistent with that, there might be less support initially and less urgency around it, but that's not the case. And we have to, as a country, my judgment, last thing, is we have to decide where we concentrate our efforts. And it seems to me, well, success is not assured. It's never assured when you're dealing with technologies. Well, it's not assured. It is more likely in this case, and it serves multiple purposes: the industry, the existing industry, potential future industry, potential export industry.
Thank you.
Right, that's a good way to think about it, actually. I appreciate that. I'm going to switch slightly back to an area that you covered a little bit. That was the illegal war in Russia, and I like to think about the global destabilizing impacts of that war as the 3 Fs, and you did 2 of them: food, fertilizer, but we didn't do fuel. So the issue here is we know Russia is a major exporter, global and European, of energy. And the case for a rapid and clean transition has been made stronger, some would argue, because of the problem with Russia's supply. Yet we hear that Canada is set to increase its oil and gas production to alleviate the increased need in Europe. I'd like to hear your insights and thoughts on this issue, both on a climate solutions front and an economic front. What impact do you think this will have on Canada's oil and gas sector as it ramps up to meet this demand, and also at the same time on our net zero goals? How do we square that circle?
Yeah, I think the first thing to say, and I like your 3 Fs. I'm like you and all the senators distressed that we're in this situation, and more distressed on the human suffering in Ukraine because of it, and the human suffering that will be felt globally as a consequence of those 3 Fs. I think the following. One is that what the war does is that it means that we, the world, will use up more of our carbon budget in the short term. In virtually every case, the displacement of existing energy sources from Russia, the knock-on effects of that, mean that a higher carbon fuel source will be burned. So one of the impacts is not on the oil side, as you know, but is in the global gas market, which has been made even tighter because of the Russian challenge, and will get worse now because of the sanction and the announcement today on cutting off Netherlands. Not surprising, but it will get worse. That displaces gas around the world. That then, in most cases, goes to coal, whether it's in Indonesia or China or elsewhere. So more of the carbon budget will be used up. And this is just raw physics. This is not the atmosphere doesn't care why the carbon lands there. It just is affected by it. So it makes the challenge harder. First thing. Second is that there is a need to strand, both for geopolitical reasons, Russian assets. So if they are being displaced, there is in the short term a need both to conserve, and that's one of the elements in Europe, but also to provide new hydrocarbon sources that can come from various places, Canada included. The third thing, though, is that there is a difference between what can happen in the short term, which candidly is not that much, and what can happen in the medium term to make a material difference to the energy system, which is somewhere around the 5-year horizon. Most LNG projects, and one of the things I did earlier in my career was to do financing for LNG projects. Those projects take a good 5 years to develop from concept to build to deliver a full new LNG train. And those projects tend to run, once up and running, for 30, 40, potentially plus years, depending on the underlying reserve. So in thinking about material new LNG, wherever it comes from, whether it comes from Canada, whether it comes from elsewhere, into Europe, it's not going to run for 40 years. Because Europe is not running a climate policy that has material gas after 2050. So it's going to run for 25 years. That changes the economics of that project, unless it, and I know there have been some talks around this, it's been in the public domain, I'm not betraying anything, unless that project has some optionality to shift from LNG to hydrogen, whether it's ammonia delivered or some other aspect of it. So that is a consideration. This, and having spoken with a number of very senior European policymakers and others, they are not, they're very focused on energy security, sustainability. They understand that to really move the needle on energy capacity, it's that 5-year horizon. Therefore, in the 5-year horizon, what's being compared is LNG with that 25-year horizon, hydrogen optionality, ramping up wind, solar, in some cases using nuclear, existing nuclear, some cases, not Germany, but some cases, and conservation measures. So the economics are shaped like that. And very often what one reads about in the paper or the public discourse talks about things in the very short term. Well, there's not that much that can be done in the very short term. That's the brutal reality for all aspects, actually, for all of your Fs, which is the challenge. I should say with the one caveat that actually on fertilizer and food, depending on the course of the war, things could change more quickly than they can change on fuel.
Great. Well, thank you for that. And then, slightly shifting gears now a little bit more to the civil society components of this, the high-level expert group on net zero emission commitments of non-state entities have been recently formed, and Catherine McKenna from our own country is now the head of that group. It's an important role and a new organization. How can a Canadian government, in an active way, play a role in helping and incentivizing Canadian firms to report and manage their climate-related financial risks? Something to do with the answer you had on the banks earlier. Sure. And how can we as Canadians help ensure that companies will actually follow through with their net zero claims?
Yeah. So the first thing to say is that the high-level expert group that Ms. McKenna is chairing, it's an important group, and full credit to her commitment. Just after she finishes one set of difficult roles, she steps into another one. But that's her character, and we're fortunate for that. What can the Canadian government do? Let me frame it this way, which is that, and I should say in this regard, Canadian governments and Canadian authorities, because there's a federal provincial aspect to it and a regulatory aspect to it. But where the world is headed is first to mandatory climate disclosure. 6 years ago, what was called the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure was catalyzed by the G20 at COP21 in Paris. I was part of that. And in effect, the charge was put out to the private sector was to answer this question: what information do you need as the financial sector in order to manage climate-related risks? Okay, risks, not opportunities, difference here. And do you have that information? And what's the quote, decision useful information? It's an American term I'd never heard before, decision useful information. And so the private sector gets together and it comes up with an answer, and gradually hundreds and then thousands of companies, including Canadian companies, start to report this information. And we start to see the types of things I was talking about earlier in terms of valuation premiums and things. Now, the private sector can only take this so far. What you get is leading companies and leading financial institutions doing this. But we're now in a position where you have $100 trillion in the private financial sector saying, we want everyone to do this because we need this information. And what happened at COP is that this new body, this International Sustainability Standards Board, was set up as the second pillar of global disclosure standards. So there's something, those of us who or look at accounting or read annual reports or work with companies know that the Canadian accounting system is part of something called the IFRS. It's a similar, not exactly the same, accounting system, disclosure system to everywhere around the world with the exception of the United States, basically. This is about climate disclosure everywhere around the world, with the exception of the United States. So the United States intends through the SEC to do something very similar. Anyways, what's my point? My point is moving from voluntary to mandatory. So you have the coverage of all companies and a level playing field to manage not just risks, but now opportunities, because the focus has become as much on the opportunities here. So that's the first thing we can do. The second thing is what's happening is that we talked a bit about net zero transition plans of financial institutions. Also, companies are developing these. And what will happen over time, it's already started in the UK, they announced this at COP, is coming in Europe, will be that these plans are mandatory for similar reasons, because we want the market to be able to work in a way that you can judge who is a plan, which plan do I want to back, and we need to get capital, particularly in Canada, where we have lots of heavy emitting industries. We want to get capital to those businesses that have a plan to get them down. As I said earlier, the easy bit, pretty easy bit, is to build wind farms and solar. We need a lot of that. Hydro, we need that. Maybe we need some additional nuclear, but the almost the higher impact is to go to the steel company, the auto manufacturer, the consumer goods company, et cetera, that has higher emissions and get capital. And for that, you need this type of information, and you need it in a consistent way across. Last point, if I may, I'm sorry, I know we're short on time, but this is a critical point, which is one of the things that companies are being asked by those who provide them with capital is not just what are your emissions, for your building and for your travel, your scope and your power that you use, your so-called scope 1, scope 2, but what are the emissions up and down your value chain, the emissions of your suppliers, the emissions of those who use the products, so-called scope 3. The importance of having scope 3 in, and there's some measurement issues around it, but they're addressable. The importance of having scope 3 in is it aligns incentives with the company and their suppliers, many of which are small, medium-sized enterprises. It becomes in their interest to help those businesses get their emissions down. And as well in terms of those who are along the value chain and users. And that's what we're starting to see. So there's a lot the government can do and our authorities can do. Last point, we need to move, with some phasing in and transition to level the playing field and make sure this information is available so we can get capital to where the emissions are and help companies get them down.
Wow. That's amazing. We're running out of time, and I know my colleagues and I are probably all the same. We wish this gone for a couple of hours, so maybe we can get you to come back and finish on some of the other discussions we've had. You started your conversation with us by talking about your experiences of multiple crises. And reminded me of President Roosevelt's comment that a smooth sea never made a skilled sailor. Well, you've clearly demonstrated to us that you're a very skilled sailor on this tempest of climate change and other things. On behalf of our group, Centers for Climate Solutions, we really want to thank you for this incredible, outstanding, and engaging conversations. And once again, I'm hopeful that we can get you back another time, this time face to face. And to continue this, because I just learned so much from you, and then I'm sure all of us have. I just also wanted, because we're leaving now, I just want to thank our staff who've all worked hard to make this possible, particularly Liliane Delage Larson from Senator Coyle's office and Amy McKay